So finally, we're going to shift topics. And this is what, like I said, I want to have a decent discussion on. And I'm going to leave it open to anyone to comment down in the bottom, right? I think this is a discussion that I feel pretty passionately about. And this is partially sparred behind some discussions we've had in the Discord over the past, few years, honestly, as well as on Twitter over the past couple of years in the spaces with Christian and Crimson Crossover and all of those guys, as well as some comments that happened in my YouTube over the past few weeks. And that discussion is around what the expectations were for last season's team for Alabama basketball and what they should be moving forward, right? When we do these podcasts and we do these spaces with Crimson Crossover, you see the spaces with Crimson Crossover, and oftentimes preseason we will get on a space with Christian and Nate Oatsburner and all the guys, and we'll talk, and there will be a discussion around what are the expectations for this year's team. And the reasonable expectations for any team, in our opinion, and in my opinion, should be a double bye in the SEC tournament, which means you're top four in the SEC competing for a regular season title. So double bye in the SEC tournament, which would mean competing in the regular season, as well as a minimum second weekend in March Madness, right? The reason we say second weekend, and the reason I think second weekend is the reasonable expectation, right? This is not what you would say, hey, this is the goal, but it's the expectation, is because the tournament is a one and done tournament, right? One loss and it's over. So because of that, you never know what's going to happen, right? Obviously, you could have a situation like this last season where Alabama runs into Duke. Duke had an incredible game. You have a number one draft pick. You have two other top 10 picks. You have a very, very good Duke team. Alabama is a 2 seed. We made the Elite Eight, right? Some fans look at that as a non-successful season. I think part of that is because the national media talked about us being a national title contender all offseason. We were a top 5 ranked team in the preseason. But when you look at it, Alabama was a 2 seed. When you look at the way the format of March Madness works, 2 seeds should be expected to make the Elite Eight, which is exactly what Alabama did, right? So Alabama did exactly what their seeds said they should do, right? And what their seeds said they should do is something that Alabama had done just one time in its entire program history prior to Nate Oates coming on campus. You made Elite Eights in back-to-back seasons, in fact, right? The only other Elite Eight Alabama had in the entire history of Alabama basketball was in 2004. So the fact that you made it in 2024 and 2025 is obviously a very successful thing for your program. So that's why when I look at reasonable expectations, right? Again, this is not goals for the program. Goals for the program should be multiple Final Fours, national championship appearances, potentially winning a national championship. That's the goals that we have set for the program. That's the goals that Nate has set for the program. That's the goals that the team and the administration have set for the program. That is the ultimate goal, right? They often talk about the goals, and it's win 4 tournaments. They wanted to win the Players Era. They wanted to win the regular season, the conference tournament, and the national championship. You're not always going to achieve all 4 goals. But if you strive for those goals, then, as they say, if you shoot for the stars, if you shoot for the moon and you fail, you'll be among the stars, right? The whole situation is strive to be the best, and all else will take care of itself, right? So as a fan base, I think our expectations don't have to be the same as what the team's goals are, right? My expectation for the team is we need to be, obviously we need to, again, be a top 4 seed in the SEC tournament. In theory, be a top 4 seed in the NCAA tournament because that gives us the best chance to make a Sweet 16 Elite 8 run. And then if you can make a Final Four, make a national championship game, have some things break your way, super successful, right? Prior to March Madness, people would have said that Alabama's last team, this last season, was a more successful team than the team the year before because Alabama was a 2 seed this past season and was a 4 seed the year before. However, Since we won one extra game, making it to the Final Four instead of the Elite Eight, there's many fans on YouTube, on podcast apps, on Twitter, on Discord that are often very upset with what the team achieved. Now, can you say, hey, I'm a little upset because I thought we could achieve X? Sure, I think it's a completely reasonable thing to say. But if you say that Nate Oates has lost it and is no longer successful and doesn't know how to recruit, and any other thing that I have read or seen over the past few weeks, few months, few years, that, in my opinion, is completely unrealistic. The expectation needs to be success and needs to be achieving at the highest level. I 100% agree. The amount that the boosters, the university, and everyone is putting into this program is to achieve at the highest level. But if you do not think that achieving a top 2 seed and making an Elite Eight is achieving at near the highest level, then you just don't have realistic expectations of what college basketball is. Right? That's what causes your Indianas of the world to be down for as long as they were. That's what causes a team like Calipari to leave Kentucky for Arkansas, because Calipari was braced with the expectations of he won a title in 2014 and had not been back recently to the Final Four, and Kentucky fans were furious. Now, did they potentially have a right to be furious because of how poorly he had done in some of the regular seasons and such? Sure. But what has Nate Oates done in the regular season but be a top 4 seed in the SEC tournament? Compete for a conference title. What has Nate Oates done in the March Madness tournament but make Sweet 16s and Elite 8s and Final Fours? He's done nothing to tell me that he has dropped off. He's done nothing to tell me that he can no longer recruit. He's done nothing to tell me that he doesn't have the ability to get back to where we were last season, where we were the season before. So if that's the case, I cannot look at last season as a failure. You had 2 injuries. Those injuries, obviously, in my opinion, played a fairly large role in some of the impact. Now, when you look at the injuries, you could even consider it 3 injuries. Darion Reed being out a huge portion of the season. Latrell Wrightsell being out a huge portion of the season. Houston Millette being out a portion of the season. Millette's a little different because he was looking to redshirt prior to the other 2 injuries, but still, you were missing 3 guys, 2 if you want to be particular. And I think that plays a huge impact because when you built the team, there was the expectation those guys were going to be available. So if you tell me, hey, you have 2 guys, one of which was a for sure starter in Latrell Wrightsell, most people, such as myself, looked at Darion Reed as a starter in the later half of the season. We thought Chris Youngblood would start at the beginning, obviously not knowing about the surgery. And then Darion Reed would start later on in the season. So if you had the expectation similar to me, we were missing 2 starters, at minimum 1. If you tell me I'm missing 1, maybe 2 starters, and I'm still making the Elite Eight, it sounds like a pretty successful season to me, right? I mean, we had Avery Johnson just a couple of years ago, and I was watching Selection Sunday trying to see if we were going to make March Madness, only to realize we were a number 1 seed in the NIT, followed up by a loss to Norfolk State. Obviously, expectations change, right? I'm not saying we have to go back to the Avery Johnson expectations. That's not all what I said. In fact, quite the opposite, right? The expectations of a Sweet 16 is nothing I would have ever put on Avery Johnson because he had never proven he could get there. But with Nate Oates, I think that's a reasonable expectation. But when you're looking at the March Madness tournament, I don't think it's a reasonable expectation to say not only do you have to make the March Madness tournament, and not only do you have to win at least 2 games, you have to win 4 games and make the Final Four to even be kind of considered okay. That's just not realistic. It just isn't. And so that's why I look at the expectations and how I have it set. This is what my current expectations are. I think this trickles over into the football program. When you're talking about the football program, a lot of people look at what Nick Saban was able to accomplish. And there's a reason why he was a first ballot Hall of Famer. Nick Saban got inducted into the College Football Hall of Fame like a year to the day after he retired. it was because Nick Saban was the greatest coach and is the greatest coach in college football history. He has 7 national titles for a reason in one of the toughest eras of college football. This is a situation where Nick Sabans do not grow on trees. In fact, every team in the SEC had fired multiple head coaches looking for their Nick Saban. So because of that, your expectation cannot be your coach is not successful if they didn't do what Saban did. Because if that is the expectation in which you're considering your coach successful, no coach will ever meet up to that expectation. So again, whether you're looking at a football coach, whether you're looking at a basketball coach, I think setting proper expectations, and again, they can be very high expectations. For DeBoer this season, I think the expectation at a bare minimum has to be a playoff. Right? I think that's a reasonable expectation for what he's being paid, for what the roster continuity has, for the fact that he's now got his offensive coordinator back. With everything set in stone, I think that the expectation needs to be a playoff for DeBoer. When you're talking about expectations for basketball, the expectation can very much be competing for that SEC regular season title, being a top 4 seed in the in the SEC tournament, being a top 4 seed in the NCAA tournament, and making a Sweet 16. Right? Making that second weekend. Those are very reasonable expectations for those two programs. But if you're as a fan and you look at it as, if I can't envision myself to win the title at the end of the season, this was a complete failure of a season, then that is not realistic. Now, if there's never a thought that you can win a title over a coach's tenure, then maybe they're not the right coach. Right? But even Saban had teams where you deep down knew this team can't win a title. And so when I see fans that are on Twitter, that are on YouTube, that are on Discord, talking about how Nate Oates is a failure because, maybe he didn't get the recruit that you wanted, or because we got an Elite Eight and you never thought we could win the title this year. Yet we were 2 games away from it last year, right? We were in Phoenix. I was in Phoenix for the Final Four. The banner hanging just over my shoulder. If you're looking at Nate Oates as a failure, even though he is the most successful coach in the entire history of Alabama athletics, in Alabama basketball, not Alabama athletics. That would clearly be Nick Saban. But in Alabama basketball, if you're looking at him and saying there is some failure of a coach because he didn't achieve what you would want him to achieve this offseason, therefore your expectations for next season are slightly worse than they were last season. And let's put this into consideration. Of the teams in the Elite Eight, just 3 of them were in the top 10 in the preseason last year. Florida was the number 21st team in the preseason last year. So are preseason expectations even that important? The answer is probably no. Right? So if the team that won the national title this last season was 21st in the preseason, and most Alabama fans are upset on Twitter, on YouTube, on Discord because they are not seeing Alabama as a top 5 preseason team, then what's the problem, right? And like I said, I think this is a discussion that I think that we should have in the comments, we should have all around. But again, I think that as a fan base, we can reasonably have an expectation to be successful. Of course. We can reasonably have an expectation to make the playoff in football. We can reasonably have an expectation to make the Sweet 16 in basketball, to compete for the SEC tournament. These are absolute SEC regular season. These are absolutely reasonable expectations. But the thought process that if you do not win the national title, and if you do not think that going into a season you can win the national title, it is a failure of an offseason, it is a failure of a basketball season, then you just do not understand how college athletic works. And you're also not taking into consideration that every team has gotten worse this offseason because there's no COVID seniors. With no COVID seniors, every team is going to look a little worse because you don't have those 5th-year guys. So that's what I have to say, right? There's a discussion around this. I'm very curious what everyone's thoughts on this are. Obviously, I feel very passionately about this, but I am curious as to other people's thoughts. I will be curious as to what you have to say down in the comments. And I will catch you in the next episode. Peace.